My name is David Scott, and I'm a PhD candidate here at the Manchester International Law Centre. Some of you may have seen me in a slightly different capacity at Thursday night's rock concert. I expect this event will go slightly differently, but if any of our speakers want to burst into song, Iain,
no.
I don't think there will be any complaints. Really, this is your time to shine. It's an absolutely huge honour to welcome the two rock stars of our conference to Manchester today and to ask them to draw together many of the themes that we've been chewing over this weekend. Now the phrase has been said a number of times, but it really is true that neither of our speakers need an introduction today. Professor Phillip Allott is Professor Emeritus of International Public Law at the University of Cambridge. His distinguished career has touched both academy and practice. As a legal advisor in the 1960s and 70s, he served for the British Foreign and Commonwealth Office and the British military government in Berlin. In 1963 to 65, he was assistant agent for the United Kingdom in the Cameron versus United Kingdom case at the International Court of Justice. In the latter half of the 1970s, he served as an alternate representative in the UK delegation to the UN Law of the Sea Conference. And for those who participated in this morning's discussion on Brexit and international law, from 1972 to 73, Professor Allott was the first legal counsellor in the UK permanent representation to the European communities at the time when the UK first became a member. Now, these achievements, and this is only a partial list, would be worthy of merit alone. But in his scholarship, Professor Allott has pursued an equally impressive yet idiosyncratic path. His 1971 piece for the British Yearbook of International Law, Language, Method and the Nature of International Law, provides a startling analysis of the construction of international legal arguments and predates by over a decade the similar insights from the critical legal studies movement. His subsequent monographs, notably 1990's Eunomia, New Order for a New World, 2002's The Health of Nations, Society and Law Beyond the State, and most recently 2016's Utopia, New Philosophy and New Law for a Troubled World, pursued a more explicitly philosophical path, by eschewing citations and other stylistic indicators by which we would normally identify legal scholarship. These works were presented in a very different vein and showed that the project Professor Allott was pursuing was something exceptionally unique. Now, I'll return to this question of Professor Allott's philosophical approach in a moment, but allow me now to turn to our other distinguished guest. Dame Rosalyn Higgins is former president of the International Court of Justice. She was the first woman to be elected to the court's bench, a point that ties back wonderfully to our opening sessions of the conference with Professors Chinkin and Charlesworth. And following the end of her second term at the ICJ in 2009, Dame Rosalyn has continued to practice, serving among other roles as the appointed advisor on international law to the British government's Chilcot inquiry into the Iraq War. Now, just like Professor Allott, Dame Rosalyn's achievements have extended into academia as well. On top of stints as Professor of International Law at the Universities of Kent and LSE, Dame Rosalyn has published a number of important academic contributions. To name but two, her monumentally influential Problems and Process, International Law and How We Use It, published in 1995, sought to continue many of the insights of Myers-McDougall's New Haven School. And in 2009, a two-volume selection of her essays and speeches titled Themes and Theories was published. I think quite critically, her academia has often brought unique insights over from the bench from her experience on the ICJ. And her 2001 article, for example, Respecting Sovereign States and Running a Tight Courtroom, is essential reading for any practicing international lawyer, or for any Jessipers in the room, any would-be moot court competition. I don't want to hold up the debate between our guests any longer, but I do want to note how perfectly this brings to a close this conference, our conference this weekend. The theme of universality figures prominently in both of our guests' work. For Professor Allott, international law is rendered as a tool for realising the universal. Philosophy can be made real through the perfectible rationality of international law, and it is our duties as scholars and as practitioners to realise these values in our work. In contrast, Dame Rosalyn is focused on law's role as a process of mediation. Regardless of particular interests, international law forces states to reason their arguments through a shared, ownerless language. The universal here is not transcendental but practical. It is one created and refined through the practice of states. The coherence and contrast between these two positions have, I'm sure, undergirded many of the fora and agora that we've all enjoyed over the past few days. And it is therefore with immense privilege that I open our final session of the conference and pass the floor to Professor Phillip Allott. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. At least your description might explain why I'm now decrepit. I feel it is an honor and a great pleasure that Dame Rosalyn has been willing to come and comment on the peculiar things I'm about to say. She at least has had the advantage of seeing them in advance. And as regards Iain Scobbie, it's his opportunity to get back at me because he was one of my first PhD students, if not the first, and he was a sort of ideal version in that he knew what he was going to say, and then he said it. I didn't supervise him very much. He said it at great length.
Yeah, I did indeed.
And I was terribly grateful and impressed by it. Now, the thing is this. By, let us say, 2:10, you will have an idea of a new world. Where will that world be? In our minds, because there's nowhere else for worlds to be. And what I'm going to do is speak very fast, because there'll be slides, but you don't need to take any notes, because everything that I'm going to say, including the slides, is on a single sheet of paper, which, God willing, you will take home and look at, meditate on. So I'm going to speak very fast, and if we could have a slide. So we begin by considering how we construct reality. And there I suggest 4 of the dialectical bases of reality. Reality is created by us every moment of every day, dialectically, by the resolution of oppositions. And these I just mention here. In the Utopia book, I deal with many others, including the universal and the particular. But there's the supernatural and the natural, spirit and matter, the natural and the human, materialism and humanism, the individual and society, individualism and collectivism, and then the one I'm going to speak about in a moment, the national and the international, of the 2 realms view versus the one humanity view. And the one humanity view, to get it installed, requires a revolution in the human mind. And that's what I've been spending or wasting the last 40 years trying to achieve. So how do we do this resolving the Aufhebung of dialectical oppositions? And so next slide, if you would please, is a marvelous summary in Wikipedia of a play by the Italian writer Pirandello, 6 characters in search of an author. Quote, "An acting company prepares to rehearse the play The Rules of the Game by Luigi Pirandello. As the rehearsal is about to begin, they're unexpectedly interrupted by the arrival of 6 strange people. The director of the play, furious at the interruption, demands an explanation. The father explains that they are unfinished characters in search of an author to finish their story. The director initially believes them to be mad, but as they begin to argue among themselves and reveal details of their story, he begins to listen. Well, the rules of the game could be international law. And this is Pirandello's play. Was the beginning, it was surrealist, now we'd call it postmodern, in which the audience breaks through the 4th wall of the stage, the invisible wall of the stage. And that's what we're now trying to do here. We as international lawyers have to break through the invisible wall and rewrite the rules of the game. That's all. Well, that's not a new idea. And I quote here from Francis Bacon in 1620. I have to say Francis Bacon, an alumnus of my college in Cambridge, one of the better ones. Quote, "Lastly, there are idols." He's discussing the ideas that obsess people, usually mad ideas that obsess people. "There are idols which have integrated into men's minds from the various dogmas of philosophies. These I call idols of the theatre, because in my judgment all the received opinions are but so many stage plays, representing the worlds of their own creation after the unreal or scenic fashion. Nor is it only of the systems now in vogue, or only of the ancient sects and philosophies that I speak. for many more plays of the same kind may yet be composed and in like artificial manner set forth. My goodness, he could say that again. Think of all the plays that have been written. Capitalism, liberal democracy, communism, fascism, totalitarianism. They're all plays which we've all acted in the centuries since Francis Bacon perceived that. Next slide, if you would, please. So the idea is that we are the author, the actor, and the audience of our own lives, individually and collectively. Past ideas made the present world. New ideas can make a new world. So what is the role of philosophy in making this new world? Well, Hegel's famous definition is philosophy is the thinking of thinking. And Bacon himself said, if any man think philosophy and universality to be idle studies, he does not consider that all professions are from thence served and supplied. And I keep telling all the scientists in my college in Cambridge, of which there are very many the limits of their subjects, that they shouldn't despise the humanities because we make society possible, which makes science possible. And of course, as you all know, there is a crisis in the humanities, crisis of self-confidence. So then the question is, what is philosophy going to work on to change? And that's the next slide, if you would. And this is selected, very selected pieces from Vattel, his book of 1758, which of course was a fabulous success and was picked up by generals and politicians and diplomats. It suited their interest. I've been struggling. I was invited to the 250th anniversary of this book in Neuchâtel, and they knew that I regarded him as the creator of all the modern problems of the world, Vattel. But nevertheless, I had to say something nice about him, which was not easy. So these, there are going to be 4 of them. And this you're very familiar with. The law of nations is a science which teaches the rights subsisting between nations or states and the obligations corresponding to those rights. Such a society, nation or state, has its own affairs and interests. It deliberates and takes resolutions in common and is thus become a moral person, having understanding and a will peculiar to itself, and susceptible at once of obligations and of rights. Next slide, if you would. Point 3, but as its duties towards itself clearly prevail over its duties towards others, a nation owes to itself, as a prior consideration, whatever it can do for its own happiness and advancement. Point 4, melancholy experience shows that most nations aim only to strengthen and enrich themselves at the expense of others, to domineer over them, and even if an opportunity offers, to oppress and bring them under its yoke. Well, that is the whole of the modern international system in 4 points. We're familiar with it, we work with it every day of our lives. Next slide, please. So there they are put together. And it's that we have to deal with. So the next question is, if we're going to create that's the existing social model of the world I'm putting forward. So the next slide, if you would. So the question is, why do we have to take action now to achieve this new world model? And so I list here 1 realm phenomena, not 2 realm phenomena. Now this great long list you're all familiar with, you've probably all written on these topics. The 1 realm phenomena topics. I'll just read them terribly fast. War between states, asymmetric war, foreign armed intervention, cyber war, failed states, nuclear proliferation, chemical and biological weapons, terrorism, climate change, human commons, the earth, the sea, the air, the space, cyberspace, human damage, the natural environment, IGOs, NGOs, globalization in all its forms, delocalized industry and commerce, international trade regulation, international human rights, international crime, epidemics, mass migration, refugees, transnational religions, the internet, social media, science and engineering and technology, global popular culture, high cultures in the plural, the humanities, the universities, international law within national law, and national law within international law. Well, those are very familiar things, and you'd have thought they did challenge a little bit the two-realm view. And previous papers in this excellent conference have mentioned those things. So then, what is the new social model of the human world, he says? Next slide, please. And it is this international society is the society of all human beings and all human societies, including states, obviously. International law is the law of international society. The ideal of the idea of law is the common good of a society. The ideal of the idea of international law is the common good of humanity. That's the new international law that we have to create. And now it becomes a bit personal, because this is how I tried to cause this in a philosophy called social idealism, which is a syncretic philosophy of all societies. It's not just Western. All societies from the family upwards obey these things that I'm going to say. I don't really have the time, but just as a side thing, I remember a seminar in Cambridge when I said, I think it's a sort of social idealism, but I daren't call it that. And somebody sitting there in the seminar, who is now a very senior professor at British Columbia, Michael Byers, said, oh, don't be silly, call it social idealism. Philosophers have got to have a name. So as a result of that, I'm grateful to him. I've always called it. So what is social idealism? It's human self-evolving and self-perfecting through ideas and ideals. Ideas and ideals are everything in the world we're talking about. Ideals are a particular form of idea. The ancient Greeks discovered this. An ideal is a thing that pushes you towards the better. It's a sort of magnetic attraction. So in resolving all the dialectical oppositions, if the ideal enters into the discussion, the classic ones, beauty, truth, goodness, solidarity, all the good things, they tend to make the dialectical resolution progressive. The Greeks didn't use the word progress, they didn't know about progress, but that's the effect of it. And the second thing about the ideals is that, as Montesquieu showed, of course, ideals differ in different societies and different times. Not everybody eats other human beings. Not everybody thinks that's a bad thing, as Montesquieu pointed out. So there's been discussion in this conference about whether you can find universal ideals. The answer is you can't, but built into the brain is the mechanism of the ideal, causing us to want the better. So that then leads to a view of all human societies over the course of time, how philosophers, for the last 26, 27 centuries at least, and in the East even longer, have sorted out what a society is. And I'm postulating that if we find a universal society, it will be like this as well, because it's just an extrapolation or continuation from societies. So then I've listed here, this is social genetics. This is what makes a society genetically. And I go through these very fast. Have we got the next slide? Yes, we have. Comically fast, because tens of thousands of books have been written about all these people. But this is the sort of ultimate distillation of it. So the first is Immanuel Kant, who told us what reality for us is. It's a cooperative enterprise between the human mind and the phenomena of a putative external reality. Very, very brilliant. And then the great Italian Giambattista Vico, social poetry. Social reality is produced by the rationality, the imagination, and the desire of human minds. It's not a thing sitting there. It's produced by these very human qualities. And then Karl Marx, well, in that case, who is the social poet? Who invents the society? The dominant story of a society is told by its ruling classes, especially its intellectual, economic, and religious ruling classes. They invent the story. And then the great and marvelous Rousseau, the magnifying of the self. The will of the individual human being can find fulfillment in the general will of a society that seeks the common good. That is a most wonderful contribution of Rousseau, and it's at the root of societies. And then Edmund Burke, organic constitutionalism. A society is an evolutionary process, adapting to new circumstances. Have we got this next slide? Yes, this is the right slide. A society is an evolutionary process, adapting to new circumstances, and the permutable paradigms first discovered by Aristotle. Above all, tyranny, ruled by one, oligarchy, ruled by the few, and democracy, ruled by the many. And would you believe, analyzing society so contemporary United States, the EU, it's a good idea to work out what the combination of those three things is. And at the moment, one might say that in some countries, tyranny is beginning to prevail, many countries. In others, it's oligarchy. A lot of them in Europe. Few people are running society. And we try to include the many through politics, if we possibly can. And then the great central idea of Confucius. A society is the presence of its past. A society is the presence of a past that contains the potentiality of its future. That's a wonderful Aristotelian idea. In Teleki, we become what we are as human beings and as societies. That's why it's genetic. It's already in us to become what we could be, so-called potentiality. And then somebody I'm fairly fond of called Plato, Ideas and Ideals. And then for him, a society is a place of human self-perfecting. And law is the universal order reflected in the self-ordering of a society. So universal society is the self-perfecting of the human species. And of course, in Plato, this is expressed in love. The whole of the development of a good society is a form of love of the self, of other human beings, other living beings, of nature, and of God. So having the will to form a good society is a sort of collective form of love, he suggested. Wonderful idea. Then over the next thing, next slide. Oh, I've got some time. I remind us that this idea of universal society is not new at all. Until Vattel, everybody referred to universal society at some time or other in their writing. And the great German Wolf said this, quote, "Just as in the human body, individual organs do not cease to be organs of the whole body because certain ones taken together constitute one organ, so likewise human beings do not cease to be members of the great society which is made up of the whole human race because several are formed together in a certain particular society." And Vattel, almost contemporaneous with Wolf, won in that little dialectical opposition. Wolf, a very, very serious German philosopher, idealist philosopher, lost because society took up Vattel's idea of international society as a collection of pseudo-individuals. And then the founders, the Spanish founders of modern international law, Vittorio and Las Casas and Suarez, they used the terms humanity and universal society because they were after 1492, when Europe suddenly discovered there was the whole world outside Europe, a lot of it extremely ancient. So they suddenly realized in the Renaissance, humanist Renaissance, that actually all the human beings are together. We're one species, and a thing called humanity, word they used and the Romans had used, humanitas, and it is a universal society. And then a very famous quotation from the English poet John Donne, no man is an island. I am involved in mankind. I always think that should be the motto of international lawyers. I am involved in mankind. That means in the well-being of mankind. And then a marvelous saying of Augustine's, remove justice, and what are kingdoms but gangs of criminals on a large scale? And he was writing that at a terrible time in the history of Rome, the end of Rome, really. But my goodness, we could use that today. There are societies at the moment in the world that are really nothing but gangs of criminals. We will not name any, in case some people may be sensitive about their own country. So finally, I always like French professors who always say finally, and then 5 minutes later, finally. But this, I think, is close to really finally. So I make the huge comparison with genetics, which is now an incredibly, it's more than metaphorical. Is this a new slide? Yeah. It's more than metaphorical. And I try to explain this in the book Utopia. It's much more than, it is something like physical genetics, the evolution of the collective life of human beings. I'm not the first person to have said this, obviously. So the comparison is with evolutionary biology, and my colleagues in Cambridge told me that evolutionary biology takes two different forms. I didn't know this. You study the genetics of the organism itself, that's one. And secondly, you can study the adaptation of the organism to a habitat. These are two, I hadn't heard this before, and I think it's quite recent. These are two forms of evolutionary study. Now, Hegel had anticipated this for our purposes in a very interesting way in history of philosophy. He distinguishes between the internal history of philosophy, that's philosophers talking to each other in a sort of permanent conversation, timeless conversation of philosophers, internal, and then the external history of philosophy, which is the effect of philosophy in society. That's a separate history. And that's a sort of, and it's Plato's distinction between philosophers and kings. You remember he said if only philosophers could be kings or kings philosophers. That is the two Hegelian forms of philosophy, internal and external. And then a saying by Popper, which is really behind all that I'm saying, the war of ideas is a Greek invention. It is one of the most important inventions ever made. Popper was a philosopher of science. I remember his wife apparently said to him, you should have stuck to mathematics, because his philosophy, published in 1945, was terribly detrimental. In my view, he thought Plato and Rousseau were terrible fascists. So finally, we must always remember the wonderful Voltaire that always brings us down from the clouds. Wonderful, wonderful Voltaire. Human beings will always be mad, and those who think they can cure them are the maddest of all. And that, I will stop now.
Well, first of all, I hope you can hear me from this sedentary position. Yes. This, I think, has been quite the most imaginative agenda that I've ever seen for a meeting on or including the topic of universality, and I warmly congratulate all involved. Questions of theory as they relate to universality have waited till late-ish in the day in the program. Our closing session today is undoubtedly a session on theory, focusing particularly on the manifestly appreciated work of Phillip Allott in that area. Now, Phillip Allott and I have known each other since time immemorial.
Indeed, if not longer.
We studied at Cambridge together at a time when the automobile hadn't been invented and everyone wore animal skins. We were, I think, still a rather bright lot, but as I've had occasion to remark before, and Philip knows this, I always thought, and I still think, that Philip was our intellectual leader. I've followed his work throughout this long time, and during his time at the Foreign Office, Philip wrote occasional pieces on normal things. They were not the writings for which he's become so famous and indeed beloved. They were technical. And as I thought of this, I thought it was rather like Mondrian showing us in his early paintings the details of leaves and trees, showing us that he had indeed mastered classical painting, allowing him the liberty to move to the yellow, red, black and orange squares and oblongs for which he's so well known. And by the way, which shapes and colours have this last year smothered offices, banks, government buildings and shops in The Hague to celebrate the 100 years since his birth. The only early period piece of Philip's with which I have a small quarrel is Philip's 1971 article in the British Yearbook in which he tore shreds off Miles McDougall for the impenetrability of his language. Now, already then this criticism was done by Philip in a language that was utterly impenetrable. I think we international lawyers should make the effort to understand complicated concepts and unusual words, so neither the berated Miles McDougall nor the opaque but lovely Allott have seemed prohibitively daunting to me. But Philip's biggest fans would not claim that Eunomia or Utopia are easy reads, or deny that a great deal of effort is required by the reader to follow his innovative ideas. So this early British Yearbook article was undoubtedly a case of the pot calling the kettle black. But then I'm reminded, I hope you all love football in the way I've always done, I'm reminded of David Beckham's reply to his manager, Alex Ferguson, shortly after Beckham married Posh Spice, aka Victoria. Ferguson told him, "You're under the thumb of your wife." And the reply was, "But what a thumb." And regarding McDougall and Allott, I can only say, what a pot, what a kettle. Now, Eunomia, Utopia, his Josephine Ono lecture, today's lecture, myriad other writing, can all be grouped together in the sense that they resolutely describe and develop, albeit in a language that requires some effort from the reader, a central idea. that urgently a new world model order is required, the current one being manifestly a failure. And Philip rehearsed briefly, and I'll take the liberty of saying it again, some of these clear failures of the state-centered world order: wars between states, cyber war, failed states, nuclear proliferation, chemical and biological weapons, terrorism, climate change, environmental damage, international crime, epidemics, mass migration, refugees, and it could go on. Now, I've long shared with Philip his sense of deep skepticism about nation states. In my experience, even the very best of them have behaved in lamentable ways we could not have believed possible of those good states. Good states. The Australian separation of Aboriginal children from their parents, the US releasing of LSD into subways used in the Harlem area, the UK Windrush recent experience. The list, I'm afraid, is endless. I share the view that at the end of the day, states are not to be trusted and have to be monitored and checked every inch of the way, and international law has a major role to play in that. A few qualifying statements. The Vatelian quote cited by Philip, that the law of nations is the science which teaches the rights subsisting between nations and states and the obligations corresponding to those rights, is, I'm sure he would agree, today is only half correct, in that it's now commonly acknowledged that the law of nations covers rights and obligations of international organizations. International organizations are, of course, largely composed of states in their dédoublement fonctionnel, but not entirely. One can think about secretariats and the important role that individuals have played within those, and of course NGOs also, with their growing power and influence. Further, it's today acknowledged that in a growing number of areas, individuals and corporations are the bearers of rights under international law, being more and more perceived as participants because we've broken free from the constraints of thinking in terms of subjects and objects of international law. But even so, it's not the world order that Philip thinks desirable and indeed essential. That society, in his view, must be, can be, achieved through philosophy and the revolutionary mobilizing of ideas. Unlike Philip, and although there is common ground between us on the wretched state of our world order system, my efforts have been less magisterially directed at explaining that law is not the mechanical application of rules, that values are inherent in decision making. Philip finds his inspiration in philosophy and particular philosophers, and as has already been mentioned, it's no secret that the Yale Law School approach has been important to the development of my thinking and writing. As I've said, I share with Philip the feelings of despair about our state-centered system. But because I see no prospect of ameliorating it save at the margins. At the beginning of the phenomenon of globalization, there were those like Mary Ann Slaughter, for example, who saw the disaggregation of hitherto state-reserved functions as the beginning of the end of a state-centered system. She wrote very persuasively, but it's not proved to be so, in spite of the building of new institutions, courts, the increased powers of NGOs. And I do not, in all honesty and friendship, in spite of his lifetime of work on this very point, see philosophy and the power of our minds as the path to this different world order. Richard Falk, in a long and appreciative review essay of Phillips' Utopia in the latest American journal issue, writes that, I quote, "We're in the midst of a regressive era in which we as a species are losing the ecological, geopolitical, and ethical struggles for a benign human future." He simply says, but regrettably without further explanation as to why he ultimately rejects Phillips' call for the harnessing of the power of our minds to secure a better future. He simply says that humility and compassion must be our guiding values, and that for him is it. I do have reasons, which are these reasons for the parting of the ways of my great friend. States are nothing more than organizationally structured individuals. Hegel says, as Phillips reminded us in materials he's provided, that without law, states are mere criminal enterprises. And without human beings being players in their assigned roles, in their assigned structures, states would not exist at all. This is Higgins and not Hegel. I have been struck by the reverence people have for this concept of the state. At the International Court of Justice, when I was president there, I found that when we were discussing making the court more efficient, there were certain colleagues who always insisted, no, you can't limit the time they want to speak. They're states. You can't stop them doing this or that. They're states. And this was a strong feature. Now, the reality is, as I've just said, that states are made up as individuals. And in the world of international law, those individuals overlap substantially with the very people you see pleading in front of you in the court. So who is the person coming to argue that special or free lengths of time for oral argument should be allowed because they're a state? It's your old friend, I won't say names, who you've seen before you 2 days ago arguing as counsel for another state. So all of this adds to my deep skepticism about the reverence we should allow to the notion of states. Now, although our state-centered world is, especially at the present time, chaotic and worrying, I find it impossible to envisage a different world order system in which individual human beings would not necessarily still be playing central roles. And that is where the problem lies, not in the state system itself. There will always be groups, tribes, political parties, religions, whatever the name of the society, whatever the embracing structure, to which individuals will give allegiance, often over values that we in this room might prefer them to concentrate on. I cannot think of a society in which this worm will not be present. Of course, there are indeed exceptional individuals who by their leadership have changed our world for the better. Gandhi, Mandela, Kofi Annan, who was buried this week, are ready examples. And there are so many others who so impressively work to help others. Think of those who day in and day out work for Médecins Sans Frontières, Save the Children, UNICEF, and so forth. But they are the exception. And in my view, no matter how we draw on philosophy to put our minds to the task, endeavors in which we human beings are definitionally at the center are in the long term doomed. Now, I hasten to add, I draw here not on any notions of original sin, but on hard-headed observation. I am very sorry when Philip over the years has inspired us with optimism and hope to offer such a bleak response. When I was on the Human Rights Committee, colleagues would say to me even then, but you see every day such awful and manifest violations of human rights. Isn't it all depressing? You're never going to change anything really. And my reply then was what it would be today. We can only do what we can do, and if we can help a handful of people, that makes our work worthwhile. So in my view, the role of the international lawyer is to ameliorate the present world order system the very best we can by explaining we're not locked into repeating certain past decisions regardless of the context in which they were made, by emphasizing that values are inherent to and not extraneous to legal decision making, and by appreciating the importance of efficacious procedure. This is not the stuff of dreams, but I hope it's been of marginal help.
Yeah, I'm meeting the sandwich. Just as we started this conference with a fairly structured conversation between Christine, Hilary, and Ralph, when John and I were planning the conference, we decided that we also wanted to end it with a reflective conversation. And we were unbelievably fortunate when Rosalyn and Philip agreed to do so. And then Jean volunteered me as the third voice. There are times when I think that Jean and I must be the Laurel and Hardy of international law, because this is another fine mess that he's got me into. My remarks are not going to be as erudite as those of Philip and Rosalyn, but for what they're worth, here they are. I'm going to start with Philip. Philip's presentation really demonstrated the culmination of his published work, or published work to date, on social idealism, which is embodied in his latest monograph, Utopia, a New Philosophy, a New Law for a Troubled World. It develops the thoughts that he set out in earlier monographs, such as Eunomia and Health of Nations, but it marks some new departures. It's published by Edward Elgar, who have asked me to note, or to tell you, it's on sale on their website at conference discount. Anyway, Utopia contains some themes that I know that Philip has had in mind for some time, and he's discussed, but it's only now that they're really in print. Reading Utopia, one of the features that really struck me was his innovation in the formal structure of his work. In each chapter, Philip sets out his thinking, but then he ends the chapter with a series of quotations drawn from philosophy and from literature, which really form a counterpoint to his argument. You know, there's kind of room for further reflection, almost in an aphoristic sense. This structure, to me, recalled, at least to some extent, the call and response structure which you find in some gospel music. And I think that this is an appropriate image because I think what Philip wants to present is good news. You know, there is hope for a troubled world. It's maybe doubly appropriate as Philip is often called the godfather of critical approaches to international law. Anyway, his view is that there is hope because the power of the human mind is transcendental. Sorry, I must get new teeth. And we can think, so we can think ourselves out of the mess that we find ourselves in. But to do so, we have to change the way that we think. We have to change fundamentally the social organization of the world by, this is quote, changing fundamentally the ideas that support the social organization of the world. The kind of pinnacle or the outcome of Philip's argument is that human will should be aimed at the highest purpose of the greatest possible flourishing of every human being within the greatest possible flourishing of the human species, which I find very Aristotelian, by the way.
Yep.
Yeah, but this idea of flourishing really requires that we transform ourself or ideas of human self-understanding. He's really trying to say, which other people say, was we've got to think ourselves out of the box. If we're looking at Utopia, there are some themes which are given a new prominence. Some struck me particularly. One is his discussion of the role that religion has played and can play in the construction of thought and identity. A recurrent theme in his work is what we might call the tyranny of history. You know, our views of the past are socially constructed, but Philip argues that history too often focuses on bad experience. You know, it focuses on evil, things that have gone wrong, which really overshadows what he terms the better experience of humanity. It's not an overstatement to say that for Philip, individual and social attitudes to and an awareness of history and historical forces are really crucial factors in the process which he will determine whether humankind flourishes or withers. I think in Utopia also there is perhaps a more obvious or a greater emphasis on philosophy as one of the comforts and one of the greatest achievements of humanity, which could also be its life belt. You know, we can think ourselves out of this box. So maybe, in a way, it's to return to the gospel metaphor, philosophy as mankind's or humankind's salvation. Akin to this role that Philip emphasizes or grants to philosophy is the role that he argues law plays in human society. But he cautions us that both philosophy and law do not provide automatic remedies for the human condition. Their impact really depends on how we use them. Now, as we saw very clearly in his presentation, Philip's argument is dialectical. It proceeds by the way of binaries, natural against supernatural, individual in society, and the realms of the national and the international. Although, to be honest, Philip would argue that the international realm is what he calls an unsociety, because, and this is a quote, the many are not able to see themselves as one, which goes back to your quotation from Wolff, which you used. Philip sees this dialectical method of proceeding as natural. It's embedded in the human brain, and it offers a chance of a progression to a better future, although he also cautions that the future could be worse than the present. Really at the heart of Philip's idea of social idealism are two notions. It's the notion of the actual and the potential. These notions allow us to make human reality into a moral order where the actual, what is going on, or what you might now call istopia, passes judgment upon itself by referring to better possibilities which lie in the notion of the ideal, which again you emphasized in your talk. This never-ending quest for the ideal is really a pursuit of the aspirational, and it's really the central message of Philip's philosophy of social idealism. It covers a set of interlocking propositions, a belief in the reality of the human mind, that the human mind is capable of reconstructing reality in the form of ideas, and that the human mind is capable to share consciousness, not only in interpersonal relations, but also within society, because Philip sees society as a sharing of consciousness. And really the human mind can determine and can pass judgment on individual and social behavior in terms of ideals. It really is it's a very aspirational idea. It's been criticized by some as being too idealistic. And there may be times when I kind of share that view, that maybe Philip is too optimistic about our possibilities. But then again, that might just be me being Presbyterian. Anyway, in the end, for Philip, the human mind has the power to form the future by imagining what that future should be, and then use reason to implement that idea. Now, I suspect Philip would deny this, but I think there are elements of natural law in his thought. Yeah, he's denied it. The idea that there are at least objective or at least intersubjective values which individuals and human societies should pursue, and this is where I now bring Rosalyn into the conversation. I mean, Rosalyn is one of the most distinguished students of Maurice McDougall, and so has roots in the Yale School or the New Haven School, call it what you will. Now, the practical aim of the New Haven School is to advance a universal world order of human dignity, which secures the widespread enjoyment of values by individuals. For McDougall and his collaborator Harold Lasswell, a value is simply a preferred event, or in other words, something which an individual or decision maker desires. One of the good points of the New Haven School, I think, was that it was very clear in what it was pursuing. It set out, it was quite honest that a full enumeration of values is really impossible. But the idea is that these values are made express in the decision making. In one of their many works, McDougall and Lasswell stated, and this is a quotation, if we were to begin to list all the specific items of food and drink, of dress, housing, or of other enjoyments, we should quickly recognize the unwieldiness of the task. They claim that any given value will fall within one or more categories that they identify, and these are enlightenment, respect, power, well-being, wealth, skill, affection, and rectitude. However, they were also very clear that their idea of human dignity, if you like, the sum of these values is not foundational. They said, it's a pursuit a pursuit of human dignity, and everyone is free to justify this in terms of their own preferred theological or philosophical tradition. In a way, I find this strive for the, if you like, pleasure is in real contrast to what we might see as a kind of British notion of utilitarianism, where we're more avoiding pain than seeking pleasure. But you're maybe going to talk about that later. I don't know. Now, I have got a question to pose to both Philip and Rosalyn. It can be formulated quite simply, but I suspect the answer is going to be rather complex. This is the question of agreement on value. Even within the scholastic tradition of natural law, there is the recognition that although human reason can make apparent precepts of good conduct, some people are more skilled in apprehending and applying these principles in practice. I mean, this is St. Thomas Aquinas' architect analogy. Another way of putting this issue was done by Perelman, who's a Polish-Belgian rhetorical theorist, who I think is woefully underknown in Anglophone circles. Perelman argues that fundamental ideas are empty frames, or they're abstract values. Everyone can agree on the value of truth, of beauty, or to use one of his examples, the proposition set out in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Agreement on these very abstract values can maintain dialogue, but when we try and pin them down, when we try to apply them in everyday life, when we try to give them content, disagreement arises. So my question to both of you is this: how can we identify and agree on the values, the ideals that we should pursue, bearing in mind that reasonable people can disagree? I think this takes us back to your idea of Montesquieu, Philip, the idea that there are different views of things. How do we reconcile these views? And that's the end. Right.
That's not a delaying It's just that it's quite a complicated question.
Indeed.
I've always admired the New Haven School, and Rosalyn has said this, for suddenly introducing into the whole discourse of international law value. That was an amazing moment. And that was the whole of their sociology, really, Laswell's sociology and then McDougall's international law. Suddenly that was a relevant discussion. And that was so new. Rosalyn and I have had experience of practical international law, and I mean before human rights. Well, they wouldn't discuss value. You discuss self-interest. So this was a revolutionary moment, suddenly, to say, well, I'm terribly sorry. Law is about value. But here's where we begin to disagree, and why I react a little bit strongly to being accused of being in any way a natural lawyer. I utterly reject the idea that we could find universal values. We know them inwardly. Each of us knows high values. And each of us in our terribly different lives tries to apply our high values and gets terrible crises of conscience if we fail. But I know that us three and anybody out there would never in a million years agree on a list of values, ever. And I'm keen to get people to realize that obviously ultimately in the brain, they have the capacity to want to do better. And they know for themselves what better is. They know the breaches of human rights are not better. And it's very complicated to explain why human rights exist as a concept, but it reflects the fact that we do want to enforce the idea of the better. And can I just, as people say, as I have the floor, we're allowed to talk about ourselves. We don't have to invite everybody.
We can if
We
you
don't
want. It's
have
up to you.
time. We don't have time. Because if I may make two quick other points, you can't be too optimistic. I am a terrible misanthrope in reality. I think human history is so shocking and such a waste of the marvelous thing called a human being. Human being is a wonderful, amazing accident of nature, capable of the most fantastic things. Human history, as somebody said, is just a list of the crimes and follies of mankind. And that's terrible. So I just try to spread optimism, although I know perfectly well the world is terrible and always has been. And this one other point. So you can't be too optimistic in that sense, that we know we're capable of being very good and very clever and very creative. But just one other point, reacting to Rosalyn's remarks, which I was rather moved by, I must say, because this is a terribly important difference that we have. It's terribly, terribly important. And I just want to mention the name Rousseau, who is my great hero. Because Rousseau, as you know, was thought to be mad during his life. Everybody said he was ridiculous nonsense that he talks. But what happened? The French Revolution happened. And they proved that not many people bought Rousseau's books. But what had happened was he'd entered into the possibility of ideas. The idea that society could be a collective search for collective good. And we've now incorporated that into liberal democracy. And that's all that I'm trying to do. I just want to make these ideas available. And the way the world is going at the moment, it may be a bit like the French Revolution, where the people who ran France suddenly respected Rousseau and said he wasn't talking nonsense all along. It is quite an important idea to say the people are the center of life and the purpose of society. Quite an important idea. And just one final point, responding to Rosalyn, this idea that in the end decisions are taken all sort of emotionally by good and bad people. I don't deny that for half a moment. I'm not a rationalist who believes that people calculate. And I've got quite a lot in the new book about emotion and the power of emotion over decisions, what emotion is. And there again, all I can say is that we're capable of terrible emotions, killing people by the million and the hundreds of millions. We're also capable of love and beautiful things from the same place in the brain. And I just want to switch that on.
Rosalyn?
I can't do better than that. I'll try just very briefly in response to you, Iain, to say that we're all agreed that one can't possibly list all the values. The values, by the way, are not just what you want in a particular instance. I really think that was not right. What you should do in a particular instance, because decision makers, even judicial decision makers or Foreign Office decision makers, invariably have choices between two possibly decent paths. What you should do in a particular instance should be illuminated by relevant values, which is slightly different from the way you put it. And we're all agreed you couldn't list those in detail. Examples were given. But I think if you take the Yale School ones, which you mentioned, they come darn near to covering things. I've never, in my experience, when thinking about a difficult decision and which way to go, and just casting my eye over them as an additional tool, I've never thought, well, isn't there a value here that simply isn't mentioned? I've never yet found that. They are broad enough to be rather all-encompassing, but it is useful to check them out.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the virtues of the New Haven thing. You know, these things are taken into account. I'm going to raise Philip's bête noire. Let's talk about Vattel.
I thought you were going to mention natural law. No.
Vattel.
We would dispose of
And
that.
it's something that, you know, both, well, dictates of reason written on men's hearts, natural law. We won't go into that.
No.
Let's talk about Vattel. If I remember correctly, in Eunomia, you argued that really, you know, the rise of Vattel really replaced, if you like, numerous forms of community with what we might call the rigidity of the state as the primary, and it's that point really the sole international actor. You also made kind of critical remarks about the state. How, do you think there's any way that we could, or there's the possibility of transcending the notion of the state and, if you like, really bringing people back into the international system?
Well, I'm terribly glad you raised that point, because it's been often said to me that you're trying to end the state, aren't you? I am not trying to end. Obviously, there will be states and all the vast complexity of international law and society at the moment. I'm trying to using a modern expression, I'm trying to resituate the state. In other words, to put something round the state, social, as we've done nationally through centuries of experience. And I'm speaking very much as a British person, we've struggled to create a structure around the executive power based on force. Weber says it's all based on force. We certainly in Britain don't believe that for half a moment, that the state is based on force. We believe it is an organ of society, and society is ultimately the people, individually and collectively. So the state, we've got to get those who rule states there to have a new conception, a new consciousness, that their job is not simply to exercise power, but to make human beings flourish. That's the only reason they've got power. And I know that sounds, again, ludicrously optimistic, but we sort of did it in our national societies. We changed from the medieval view that was a single source of authority in society to the more modern view, post-medieval view, that there are lots of sources of authority in society, including ordinary people shouting and writing in newspapers and everything. So that's what we've got to resituate the state. We've got to tell those people. I mean, they love their power, obviously, as Rosalyn mentioned. Of course, they love deciding these things in their own interest. But the worst thing about Vattel for me was this quasi-person idea. That the state is a quasi-person with a mind, interests, will, and a clear purpose in life to maximize itself. Those things. It's a brilliantly clever book in which she synthesizes centuries and centuries of history, landing up with this very, very clever vision of the state as a quasi-person. But it's turned out, as we know through 2 world wars and genocides all over the place, that it can be very bad.
I can only agree with that.
I'm getting views from my colleague Jean that it's now time to end this session. Thank you, unless you want to say anything very quickly. Thank you very much. It's been really great. Thank you.